بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. Jazakum Allahu khairan for the organizers of this program. May Allah put plenty of barakah and khair in it, inshallah. It's an extremely important program. And I think the setting for it, although it's unfortunate that we are not in person this year, as Sheikh Azim al-Din said, the fact that we are online actually allows for participation also for people from all over the place. So there's good in everything. This is from the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Also that the one who tafa'al khayran tajidhu, if you look for the good in things optimistically, you will find it. So alhamdulillahi ala kulli hal. Can I share my screen? I believe I should be able to.
You should be able to.
Yeah, okay. All right. Oops. Okay. Can everyone see this? Negotiating Paradigms, Islam and the Modern Worldview. Is this clear?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, the title of this year's program, this year's Winter Intensive, of course, as you know, mainstay of the Muslim, navigating modernity as a minority community. And I think this is a topic whose importance we do not need to belabor because it's crystal clear to everybody. We feel it, we live with it every single day, and are often stymied and confused by it, and don't really know how to navigate our way. So we're going to try over the course of the next few days to learn the lay of the land, to learn how to navigate the ship, inshallah, in what are often very stormy and choppy waters. And what I would like to do to begin with is that I think a very important or a very fundamental aspect that we need to have in place in order to deal with a lot of these challenges is to look at this question of what is a worldview. Because really at the bottom of it, so many things we look around us, and we as Muslims today, we live in a world that is not of our own making, as it has been said. Of course, from the time of Islam, after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, the Muslims spread very rapidly and basically came to occupy much of the known world of the time. And for the following 1,000 years, Islamic civilization was dominant, as we all know, in material, political, and economic terms, as well as, of course, spiritual terms, which is the most important. But there was no major world civilization that did not border the Islamic civilization and that was not deeply impacted by it, not least of them being Europe itself. Over the last several hundred years, however, there has been a radical shift of the balance of power in the world, where the Muslim world and all other areas outside of Europe/America, has basically retreated in at least a worldly sense and come to occupy a subordinate or peripheral position, with modern Europe rising as of, say, the 16th, but particularly the 17th century, to a place of prominence, which ushered in the first kind of truly global world system in which the entire globe was now and is now still incorporated into one paradigm. This paradigm is not of our making. The world would look very different if it were, but it is a paradigm that is based on a European model, which starts out as a Christian model, but then secularizes as we move into the modern period. And this worldview, this way of looking at the world, is pervasive now, especially for us living here in the West, but increasingly over the globe, because there really is no East and West anymore, especially after the rise of the internet, even before, but especially after the rise of modern methods of communication. Everybody is everywhere and everything is all over the place. You can be in Jakarta, you can be in Riyadh, you can be in anywhere you want, and you have access to the same sort of cultural products, the same entertainment, the same ideas. Very often your schooling is based on a Western model. You live in a modern nation state also based on a European model. So how do we get to, so obviously for many of us Muslims today, we feel a great sort of tension within our souls. And so we feel that obviously there are conflicts. Islam says one thing, but the world around us says something else. We believe this is true, they say it's false. We believe this is false, they say it's true, and so forth, so on and so forth. And we often don't know how to deal with this tension. So my contention is that a very effective way to do it is to take a step back and look at the overall paradigm from afar and to, first of all, conceptualize what is this thing called a worldview. So basically, a worldview, I would say everybody has a worldview, and a worldview, well, all right, so what is a worldview? I mean, here you have this picture of someone looking at a globe. Obviously, we're not talking about it in terms of a physical worldview, but we're talking about a conceptual frame of reference through which one interprets the world. As we said, in the modern age, especially for many of us Muslims, we feel that there is sort of a tug of war going on. We grow up with Islam, but we also grow up in the midst of this paradigm, which is based on something a very different set of assumptions and process of viewing the world. And so we feel there's a tug of war between us and them, East and West, Islam and America and Europe and so forth. And this often leads to people talking past each other, people arguing, people getting into conflict. Of course, Samuel Huntington's famous, Clash of Civilizations thesis is one manifestation of this. But whether one endorses the thesis or not, clearly there is a lot of, mutual recriminations, we could say, that take place on both sides or all sides of the current world situation. So often we don't know how it is that we should communicate with other people. How can we make Islam known to other people? How can we make it comprehensible to other people as a very minimal first step? Because in fact, we are sent to make da'wah. We are actually supposed to call people to Islam. And we're having trouble nowadays even making Islam sort of understandable and minimally plausible to people, let alone calling them to it, right? So this raises a great challenge in the way we communicate with others. But also, and this is even more fundamental, we often feel a confusion within ourselves. There is no person who has grown up, I would surmise, in the modern world, Muslim who has grown up in the modern world, who has not had some very basic questions about, wait a minute, how could this be true? There are certain things in the modern way of looking at things that conflict radically and fundamentally with Islam and vice versa, right? And because we're exposed to both of these paradigms, half the time we're thinking with one hat and half the time we're thinking with another. And when these two conflict and clash with each other, very often it can lead to a profound sense of malaise for us internally. And it can even lead to, the sort of rankling in the heart, a disquietude of the soul. And also it can lead to actual questioning of the faith, questioning of our commitments, questioning of our belief. According to some surveys, I believe a Pew survey, and I don't know, how accurate it is, but it is estimated that up to 25% of born Muslims end up leaving the faith in the West. Now, maybe many of these people grew up in very secularized families to begin with and never really had more than a kind of loose cultural attachment to Islam, Allahu A'lam. But we tend to look, when we talk about, for example, the number of Muslims in America, how are we counting that number? We're counting it by the number of sort of born Muslims from like a Muslim background with Muslim names. And so that is kind of how we, judge our numbers. And probably if you take it from an actual belief angle, you would have to cut out a lot of those people. And if it's true that 25% are leaving, that's really quite startling. We often say Islam is the fastest growing religion in America, but according to these statistics, Islam is actually not growing at all. It's still doing better than other religions, however, because other religions are bleeding and hemorrhaging and losing members without replacing them. Whereas Islam, because there are quite a substantial number of converts, it seems that we're at least replacing, people who leave out the back door. You have new converts coming in to replace them. So Allahu A'lam, but it seems like we are holding our numbers, but probably not increasing at the current time. Anyway, numbers is not what it's all about. That's part of the sort of reign of quantity that's very characteristic of modernity that we don't actually want to adopt. And so quality is always more important than quantity. But nevertheless, you can see my point that many of us, people leave Islam because they find it not plausible or not ethical or not reasonable, given the paradigm which is presented to them as the default. And so this is what we want to start to get to the bottom of. So what is a worldview? I've used this word several times now. And so let's talk a little bit more about what a worldview is. So here's a definition that I found on the internet. It's as good as any other. So I'll read this. A person's worldview represents his most fundamental beliefs and assumptions about the universe he inhabits. It reflects how he would answer all the big questions of human existence. Fundamental questions about who and what we are, where we came from, why we're here, where, if anywhere, we're headed, the meaning and purpose of life, the nature of the afterlife, if there is such a thing, and what counts as a good life here and now. Okay, so all of the major questions of existence that thinking people have always asked themselves. Few people think through these issues in any depth, which is a problem for us, and fewer still have firm answers to such questions. But a person's worldview will at least incline him towards certain kinds of answers and away from others. Okay, so worldview is sort of a comprehensive, it's the sum total of all of the fundamental assumptions that you hold about the world. What exists, what doesn't exist. What does it mean when someone says, we know that X, Y, and Z is the case? What does it mean to know? What are the sources of knowledge? How can you establish something as a element of knowledge as opposed to just subjective belief, for example, right? What is a human being? How should one act? Is there a purpose to life, either the sort of existence of the universe or my personal existence as a human being? Or are these things, is there no objective purpose and I'm left to sort of create and project my own purpose onto the world and so forth? So all of these come together and form the worldview. And as the person here, this was actually taken from a Christian website, states, most people are very unaware of their worldview. It is something that lies very, very deep within a person's psyche. It is acquired from the environment very much in the way a language is. And your worldview is the paradigm through which you think and through which you view the world, and therefore it's very difficult to see it if you've not been trained to look at it and identify what its constituent parts are. It's like when you put glasses on, you see through the glasses, you don't see the glasses, right? And so most people utterly take their worldview for granted, just like if you grow up, especially in a monolingual environment, and you grow up just speaking one language, then you take your native language utterly for granted. Of course, all children acquire their native language or languages in a non-reflective, completely natural manner. And you open your mouth, and if you grow up in America, you open your mouth and English comes out. Like that's just what happens. And it can be very difficult to sort of see the structure of your native language until you actually sit down and are told, wait a minute, language has components. There are nouns and verbs and adjectives, and here's how they interact. And especially when you now learn a second language, and then you see not all languages operate the same way. In English, for example, we put the adjective before the noun. I'm wearing a blue shirt. In Arabic and the Latin languages, many others, it's the other way around. I'm wearing a shirt blue, right? And so when you are exposed to another language, you say, oh, well, wait a minute. I didn't realize there was another way to do this, right? There are some basic sort of universal probably categories that exist presumably in all languages, like a category of nouns by which you denote substantive things, words by which you denote qualities of those things. In English, we would call those adjectives, verbs, so words that denote actions rather than things, and so forth. Presumably, these kind of generic categories would exist across all human languages because all human beings need to express these different generic categories of meanings, but the way each language works is very specific to that language. And again, it's not really until you are exposed to another language that you can start to see that languages are actually relative and they're not just to be taken for granted. And I think when it comes to worldviews, it's very much the same thing. If you grow up in a unified, I don't know if anybody does anymore particularly, but if you grow up in a relatively unified worldview, you will simply adopt notions about the world, notions about truth, notions about reality, notions about value and meaning that you will simply acquire and reproduce totally automatically without even thinking that there's possibly another way that the world can be seen or interpreted, or that something other than what you already believe could actually be true. Of course, as Muslims, because we do exist sort of very consciously between two worldviews, we are probably more aware of what a worldview is, at least in terms of the effects it leaves on our hearts, as I said, than a lot of other people in modern society for whom there really is no contender. There is no serious kind of Christian worldview, except for, there are obviously some people who still hold to that, but for a great many number of people in the modern world, the past kind of religious worldview is over. It's a thing of the past, and everyone is essentially a modern person. And we'll talk about what that means. And there really is no other paradigm outside of which to think or with which to compare or evaluate the modern paradigm. I think as Muslims, we have a unique position because we very consciously adhere to a paradigm that is different, has different roots and assumptions than the modern, sort of secular worldview, again, that comes out of a secularizing Europe. And because we are still, by and large, clinging onto that, we are aware we are aware of the differences. It's like also, I mean, again, the analogy with language is very apt here. Many Muslims are at least bilingual, if not trilingual. Many people in the United States and in Western Europe are, say, second-generation Muslims. They often speak, obviously, the dominant language of their society, as well as a home language, Urdu, Arabic, whatever Turkish language it might be. And so, most Muslims are aware that, okay, there are different ways of talking, there are different ways that languages can describe reality, because they have at least two languages and they can see that they don't really say things the same way, right? They don't also conceptualize the world the same way either. And so when it comes to worldview, it's the same for us. Now, to push the linguistic example a little bit further, if I may, as probably most of you know, if you are bilingual or grew up, in a family with parents who came from elsewhere to the United States or Europe, you will know that the two languages are often in your mind are not equal, right? Most people growing up, especially in the United States, are not what they would call balanced bilinguals. They are obviously dominant in one language, usually the ambient language of society, in our case, English. And the home language is sort of L2, language 2, it's a second language. And the mastery of it obviously is less, and it's not the parents' mastery who grew up in the home country. Often there's also a lot of code switching in immigrant families, which means that, even the parents after, decade or two who grew up native in whatever language from back home, they've lived in the US so long, the whole life around us goes on in English. So when they speak, they start mixing a lot of English in, half Urdu, half English, half Arabic, Aranzia or whatever, English Arabic type thing. When it comes to languages, just, you can have whatever attitude you want about language purity and whether it's desirable or not to mix codes like that. But in the end of the day, language, to at least a substantial degree, is a practical tool of communication. And there isn't a question of, there's no moral value attached to it. You're not going to be held accountable by Allah, for example, on the Day of Judgment because you didn't speak a pure Urdu at home, or, you mixed Arabic with French or something like that, right? But when it comes to the worldview, many of us are doing the same thing. We're kind of code switching, a lot of code switching. So in certain aspects of our lives and in certain circumstances, we are very Muslim, particularly in a masjid. We think Islamically. We kind of say the right things and sort of, conceive of the world, presumably in a way that's, in line with Islamic teachings. But then when we go out or we're in another setting, we often don't realize it, but we slip into a very different set of assumptions. We use a very different kind of language, and we often appeal to a very different set of foundational principles. And so there's kind of a, worldview code switching that goes on. And the reason this is more of a problem, as opposed to the language example, is that when it comes to the worldview, we're talking here about questions of truth. We're talking here about questions of reality. We're talking about questions of what is and is not. We're talking about questions of what's right and wrong, halal and haram, right? And these have obviously a direct bearing on our what kinds of people we are in this world, and also on our ultimate destiny in the hereafter. So it's actually quite dangerous if our worldview starts getting mixed up and we start code switching carelessly and come out with a mishmash, right? And then the thing that's even more dangerous about that is that just like in language, this type of code switching doesn't really last very long. In most immigrant families, you will find that the first generation has some command of the home language, but by the second generation, i.e. the immigrant people's grandchildren, and certainly great-grandchildren, almost always the home language is completely gone by that time, and only the dominant language remains. And so it's only English and no Urdu, no Arabic, no home language, right? Again, that's sort of a natural language assimilation that takes place. The problem is if this happens with our worldview, the analogy would be second generation believes much in Islam, maybe kind of modernized a bit, Americanized a bit. The next generation, it's much more Americanized, modernized, secularized, and we'll talk more about this, with a more tenuous, connection to actual normative Islamic beliefs and teachings. By the third or fourth generation, what's going to be left, right? So because you're code switching and mixing and matching, right, ultimately one dominates. And just like English will dominate linguistically, also the ambient worldview will, if we're not aware of what's going on, can easily come to dominate without us actually knowing that it's going on. Okay, so let me move on. So just a few more and we'll go quickly. Worldviews shape and inform our experiences of the world around us. Like spectacles with colored lenses, they affect what we see and how we see it. Depending on the color of the lenses, some things may be seen more easily, or conversely, they may be de-emphasized or distorted. Indeed, some things may not be seen at all. Worldviews also largely determine people's opinions on matters of ethics and politics. What a person thinks about abortion, euthanasia, same-sex relationships, environmental ethics, economic policy, public education, and so on will depend on his underlying worldview more than anything else. Again, most people don't articulate it in this way, and you'll see many people fight about these issues, abortion and this and that, all of these other things, and they don't realize that, in fact, the opinions that they're holding are really the logical entailments of very deep-lying assumptions, foundational assumptions that are by and large unexamined by most people. And because they're unexamined, people don't really know how to navigate either their conflicts between themselves and others, or again, the conflicts within themselves, right? Where you're hearing one thing from one side, another thing from another side, and you don't know how to navigate the rupture. So as such, worldviews play a central and defining role in our lives. They shape what we believe and what we're willing to believe, how we interpret our experiences, how we behave in response to those experiences, and how we relate to others. Our thoughts and our actions are conditioned by our worldviews, right? So we actually are impacted much more than we think by our worldview, and that's why it behooves us really to kind of grasp what a worldview is, and then what our worldview is as Muslims, what the surrounding dominant worldview of our age is, which is kind of the modern secular paradigm, and then to see in what ways these overlap, in what ways they diverge from each other, and what are the implications of that overlap and quite often that divergence, and again, how can we sort of navigate those gaps. So what are the main components of a worldview? Again, now before we go into this, just to make it clear, everybody has a worldview, just like everybody has a language. So human beings, part of what makes us human, as we'll talk about, is our capacity to acquire and use language. There are currently some 5,000 languages existing in the world. Many of them have only a few hundred speakers and are at risk of dying out as soon as those speakers die. But there are 5,000 languages or so in the world. Every human being has at least one language. Many people grow up, actually more people in the world grow up bi or trilingually than monolingual. Strikes many Americans as odd because most people in America are monolingual. But there's no human being that doesn't have an actual language, although the languages differ. Similarly, everybody has a worldview. Whether you grew up in America in the 21st century, or Isfahan in the 14th century, or the Amazon rainforest in the 3rd century, or ancient Rome, or wherever, right? Everyone has sort of fundamental set of assumptions about the world, just like everyone has some kind of language. Now, if I want to know what kind of language do you speak, I'm going to ask, well, how do you form your words? What does your morphology look like? What about your syntax? How do you again, where do you place adjectives with regard to nouns? How do you, deal with verb tense and aspect and all of that? And when you ask all of these questions about someone's language and you put that all together, you can get a pretty good idea of their language. Oh, okay, now I have a conception of what language you speak or what kind of language. When it comes to a worldview, again, I would submit that there are also some basic categories that we can think in terms of, that if you want to know what a person's worldview is, you basically ask a number, not explicitly, but you would try to find out the person's response or the culture's response to a number of basic questions, or how basic categories of assumptions about the world would be answered, or boxes would be filled, and that will give you a picture of the person's worldview. So bear with me, there's going to be some slightly technical terminology here. Probably most of it you've heard, but they're not always everyday words, but we can deal with it, it's okay. So I would say the first, and there are different ways to do this. This is my own kind of framing of it. I think these categories cover a large part and the most important parts of a person's worldview. We can certainly add others to them, but the most basic kind of question, or the most general or universal question we can ask, or questions we can ask, are questions of ontology. Ontology basically means the study of what is, what exists and what doesn't exist. What kind of entities exist? Does the tree outside my window exist? Do I exist? Does my mind exist? Do I have a soul? Does God exist, right? I mean, God, it would be an existent, a kain, something mawjood, if God exists. So in a worldview, so ontology is what exists, okay? Is there an unseen realm? Are there angels? Or is it just what I can empirically verify that exists, right? These are all questions of ontology, and the way a worldview answers this is quite impactful, has quite an impact on the way a person sees the world, as I think should be obvious, and we'll get into it in some more detail. Among the things that may or may not exist, I mean, just hypothetically speaking, is God, right? Does God exist? If the answer to that question in a particular worldview is yes, then you will have a theology, right, in addition to an ontology. And then I put theology higher because if God does exist, then God is the primary existent and therefore the most foundational existent. And so theology then becomes sort of the highest category of reflection and of knowledge and of understanding, because it pertains to the highest being and to the most foundational aspect of all existence, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? So who or what is God if God exists, right? So you would have a theology. So theology sort of branches out of ontology, but again, just if you're thinking about it through it logically, you don't get to a theology until you answer the ontological question of, is there a God, right? And if there is, well then God comes first, okay? The next set of questions, also very fundamental, that we can ask are questions of epistemology. Probably most people are familiar with this term, epistemology. What is knowledge and how do we acquire it? What does it mean to know? And more particularly, more importantly for us, what are the sources of our knowledge? When I say I know that, or we know that, as opposed to I think that, or I conjecture that, or I merely believe that, okay? X is the case. What does it mean to know, and what are the sources of knowledge, right? Then anthropology, and I don't mean by anthropology sort of the modern university discipline, but I mean in the sense of who or what is man. Anthropos is al-insan, so this is ilm al-insan. They actually translate anthropology as ilm al-insan, but I mean the more fundamental philosophical question, right? Anthropology is an empirical science in the modern university, but I mean as a philosophical question, who or what is man, okay? And we'll see this debates about human origins, evolution, and so on and so forth. Many people just dive into this as if it were a purely scientific question, which is to concede so much ground to the materialistic view of the world, as we will come to see, that people don't understand that this is first and foremost a philosophical question, and the place of science in answering this question is going to depend on your philosophical answer to the question first and foremost, before getting out like DNA evidence and going through the fossil evidence and all of that. So anyway, anthropology. Then we have the question of teleology. So is there a purpose? Telos means purpose, ghaya they would say in Arabic. Is there a purpose of the universe, of man? I brought these questions up before. Or is there no purpose? Is there no teleology? Okay. Then we have question of morality and ethics, as we said before. What am I to do? How ought I to behave? What ought I to do or not to do? Question of morality and ethics. And how do we know? How do I know what's right and wrong? How do I know what I am to do or not to do? So what is right and wrong? Then after this, question of law and politics. And these are kind of in descending order of generality to specificity, also abstraction to concreteness, you know, however you want to look at it. It's not really too important right now. But then morality and ethics is also apply, you know, based on your moral and ethical assumptions. You have questions of law and politics. What is valid law? Where does law come from? What is a good law that should be obeyed by, you know, citizenry is kind of a modern term, but by the people living in a particular place, right? What laws are valid? And how do we know that? And then what kind of political system is sort of roughly ideal, knowing that we live in an imperfect world? What is sort of the best kind of, you know, political arrangements we should come up with? And many people don't realize, right, that questions, especially many of the burning questions today, and that sort of cause the most problems for Muslims, both in our interactions with others and in terms of our own sort of again, fighting within ourselves, are really questions mostly of morality and ethics, and also of law and politics. And people don't realize that how we approach questions of morality, of law and politics, is dependent on an underlying conception of morality and ethics, which itself is dependent on an underlying knowledge, underlying assumption of what kind of creature the human being is and what the human being's needs and interests are, which all is therefore dependent on a particular epistemology and an ontology. So all of these are interconnected. And it's a mistake, and I think it's a very grave mistake that many Muslims today are making when they start to deal with particularly these lower order questions. I mean, lower order not in the sense that they're less important, but in the sense that they are derivative from higher order assumptions about the world, right? Many people dive into morality, moral and ethical questions, and legal and political questions, and just argue about them on the surface without understanding that, again, the difference between one person's view and another really does go back to much more fundamental assumptions about, again, on these higher levels, ontology, either higher or like deeper lying, however, you want to look at the metaphor, ontology, epistemology, anthropology, and so on. And you'll see why, hopefully, as we go on. And then there's a question, I put the last one, the question of aesthetics, which might be kind of unexpected here in otherwise what is otherwise a very kind of philosophical and dry terminology so far, the question of what is beauty and what is beautiful. And I always say that you can actually tell a lot about a culture and about the worldview of a people or of a civilization by looking at what it regards as beautiful and therefore what it produces as art, right? And you can, especially in the case of like Western history, which has changed a lot over the last 1,000 years, if you just take an overview of Western art from the Middle Ages through the Renaissance, through the early modern period into the 19th century, 20th century, so forth, you can really tell a lot about what is going on in the culture, what kind of values are being held, what's important, what are priorities, what are some of the basic assumptions about the world, just by looking at the art that this civilization kind of produces. And it's as true about Islam as it is about Western civilization or any other. If you look at our art, whether it's architecture or calligraphy or whatever, that's a very particular worldview which is capable, which produced that. And it is therefore redolent of a very particular way of looking at the world and expressive of it. So aesthetics is actually also, I think, important. Also, the aesthetic aspect of life is a fundamental one, which is downplayed, particularly as of the mid-20th century, which is why anything built in the 1950s and after is usually very ugly. Anyway, at least for a couple of decades, you get very ugly architecture. Okay, so we are dealing mostly with two worldviews, Islamic and modern Western. Why? Well, because we're Muslims, obviously. Modern Western, because we happen to live in a time and place by Allah's will, where the modern Western paradigm is the dominant one, okay? If we had been living in some other time and place, it might be the Islamic worldview and Confucianism. It might be the Islamic worldview and, whatever, something else. Christianity, if we were living more in a world that was still sort of thoroughly Christian, and if that were the other kind of contending paradigm, we would be having a different discussion. So the modern worldview is based on a secular paradigm, which is born of a Christian womb. We don't have really time to unpack this, but modernity bears distinct traces of its origins. It is a universalized paradigm. Most people just join it without realizing, it's like everyone else speaks English, right? English became the lingua franca, and you can speak English and so forth without knowing the genealogy, that it's a Germanic language, that it was heavily influenced, through the French conquest, with many Latin words, so it changed a lot. You don't need to know all of that in order to kind of appropriate English and use it, right? Similarly with the worldview, people just kind of join onto modernity and they don't realize that much about it is very specific to Christian culture. There are certain aspects of modernity which carry kind of Christian assumptions, and there are others which carry sort of anti-Christian assumptions, and they are what they are because they are reactions against certain aspects of Christianity, which may or may not actually concern Muslims. I mean, a lot of times there are certain features of modernity that, again, either it's Christian, but Islam is different on that point, or it's like a reaction against Christianity, but Islam didn't take that position to begin with, and so the reaction against it is not really justified from our point of view. But who knows this, right? I mean, you just kind of, the paradigm is presented to you and you just sort of absorb it, okay? So very quickly, we're not going to go through this, the progression of the modern worldview. We don't have time to talk about it, but we could go all the way back to the 15th century Renaissance. This is the beginning of the move from a more theocentric worldview. Again, you can look at the art before this period. It's all religious art. Usually, you've seen the images of Isa alayhi salam, or representations of him on the cross. Of course, we know he was not crucified. But, you had, of course, go into the old Gothic cathedrals and you find murals of like heaven and hell and sort of biblical themes. And once you get into the Renaissance, there's a revival of ancient Greek, which was a pagan, kind of monotheistic culture, right? A stress on the human being now becomes the focus of attention. You can see Renaissance paintings with like people, of just people, and so forth. So there's a humanism that is resurrected at this time, which is very central to the modern view of the world, right? The humanism and the human centeredness, the anthropocentric, as opposed to theocentric nature of the modern world is very fundamental. And then we go to the Reformation. This is 16th century. Martin Luther revolting against the church. There are many, modernity is a Protestant phenomenon. It's not a Catholic phenomenon, right? Catholicism has actually, sort of struggled against many fundamental aspects of modernity ever since the beginning. It usually loses, but the whole notion, for example, one of Martin Luther's most salient notions is the priesthood of all believers, right? So throwing off the kind of corrupt leadership of the church, that institutional, hierarchical, ecclesiastical authority, he proclaims that every believer is his own priest, which we would agree with as Muslims in the sense that, okay, we don't go to a priest or an imam or something like that, sheikh, to confess our sins like you do in Christianity or Catholicism, right? You sin, you turn straight to Allah, you worship Allah directly. There's really no intermediary. There's no intermediary in your worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. At the same time, we are not Protestant in the sense that it's not up to every individual just to open the Quran and interpret it however he wants, or to, come up with ahkam of the Sharia however a person wants, just by sitting down and flipping through stuff and kind of coming up with your own interpretation. But Martin Luther said every believer is his own priest in the sense that he confesses straight to God, doesn't have to go to a priest, but also his understanding of the Bible and of Christian, theology is personal and direct. You open the Bible, you read, and the Holy Spirit will, inspire you directly with the correct meaning. Of course, Protestantism broke up into like 400 or 500 sects. Many of those are very minor, but you have a huge schismatic, because there's really nothing to tie it together. And we as Muslims, again, you could see, so fast forward to the modern age, and many people will say, oh, it's just a kind of unspoken assumption that goes all the way back to this time of the modern world that, okay, religion is ultimately this private, personal, subjective belief, and then everyone has a fundamental right to kind of interpret the religion however he wants. That's just completely unspoken. And we live in that environment where you go say, no, but Islam says this. Now you get people say, well, that's your interpretation. Who are you to say, I read it like this, and who are you to, you're not God, right? This would be unthinkable in many different contexts, right? Certainly in any Islamic context, this is unthinkable, right? Where does our normativity lie? Well, we have a scholarly tradition. We have sunnah. We have things that are passed down through an uninterrupted train of transmission, right? So it's not ecclesiastical authority. There's no sort of church in Islam, nor the equivalent of a church, right? A mosque is just a building where you go to pray. It's not an institution. There are no councils and synods that come together to sort of promulgate doctrine and then, impose it, on pain sometimes of death and burning and so forth. We don't have that, right? But we have a scholarly tradition, which in a sense, that's also a very modern notion that what's right, what's true and not true, we know through scholarly means. But for us, our scholarship includes obviously revelation, Quran, hadith, fiqh, and so on and so forth. But we have a scholarly way of going about it. So if you look at this, the Protestant kind of revolt against the Catholic hierarchy and the notion, therefore, of this radical individualism when it comes to questions of religious belief and practice, right, which is now embedded deeply in the modern consciousness and taken for granted as an unspoken assumption. That, from our perspective, is A, it's an illegitimate, presupposition, and B, there's no need for Muslims to have ever developed such a thing because we don't have that type of ecclesiastical hierarchy that we would have needed to react against. So this is one example where you can say, okay, I understand that feature of modernity, but guess what? Like, I can look at it critically, and I also see its genealogy. I understand how and why it came about, but I also see why it doesn't apply to me as a Muslim, and why it doesn't make sense for me to sort of just assume this with no further ado and start, appealing to such arguments or sentiments in my approach to my religion, or our approach collectively in our community, right? So anyway, this is just, and then we go on the progression of the modern worldview in the 17th century. Of course, you have the scientific revolution. Descartes at the beginning of the century, or mid part of the century, often considered the first sort of truly modern thinker. Of course, his famous statement, "I think, therefore I am." This is another move towards kind of humanism, human-centeredness, and subjectivism. Descartes thinks, therefore he is, right? So his entire ability to affirm reality comes back to his own very personal subjective consciousness, right? And again, this is very central to the modern worldview, the kind of centrality of the human being, also the subjectivity, and we'll see this a little bit later. I want to go quickly. And then we go into the 18th century. You have, philosophy in the 18th century sort of accommodates the scientific revolution. So you have Newton, of course, at the end of the 17th century. His Principias published in 1687, right, and brings about massive, basically inaugurates sort of what we understand as the scientific revolution and the inauguration of the age of modern science. Philosophy in the 18th century kind of tries to accommodate the new science by basically rearranging its view of ontology, what exists and what it doesn't exist, to be constrained to the natural empirical world that science, that this new very powerful science is able to investigate. And also epistemologically, it accommodates it by keying the question of what we can know to, again, the scientific method, and making knowledge basically a question of knowledge of the empirical world, with any knowledge claims going beyond that being relegated to the realm of subjectivity and belief and surmising, or rather than actual knowledge. And we'll see that, this is very critical and important for us as Muslims, or any serious religious believer. That's the 18th century. 19th century, you have the progression of the modern worldview. This is the century of the secularization of the European mind. Of course, that's a gradual process, but really comes to full fruition in the 19th century. Early in the 19th century, you cannot be hired to teach in a European university if you're an atheist. It was unthinkable. Who would hire such a person to teach people in a respected institution? In the middle of the century, you have, of course, Darwinism, which plays a large role in the secularization of the European mind. Again, a process that's already going on, and in a sense, Darwinism is partially a result of this process of kind of materialization and secularization of the mindset, but it also pushes like a give and take. Not a give and take, it's like, this sort of Darwinian interpretation of the world and of the data found and so forth is part of the scientific revolution and the shift in paradigm that brings about. But then also the thesis itself kind of further sort of seems to, for many people sociologically at the time, to justify and excuse atheism. And in fact, even Richard Dawkins doesn't need to be presented to you. You know who he is. Even he says before Darwin, you could not really be a intellectually satisfied atheist, because before Darwin, like, how could you really have explained the world without the way we know it, without appeal to some type of God, even if a deistic God of the 18th century, sort of, Deus ex machina, they said, ex machina, a God outside of the machine that he created, the world now viewed as a clock, basically clockwork, right? But there had to be some appeal. But after Darwin, it now becomes all of a sudden intellectually and socially respectable to be an atheist, because people can appeal to immanent processes which seem to have produced, what had been thought of the pinnacle of creation, which is man, through kind of blind, directionless material processes. And so by the end of the 19th century, of course, you have Nietzsche with his famous, very blasphemous statement about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God is dead. We shouldn't even say it, but of course, Allahu huwa al-hayyul qayyum. Allah is the living and the ever-abiding, whereas Nietzsche is dead. So anyway, 20th century, you have the progression of the modern worldview. the century of high modernity, particularly up until about the 1960s. These buildings show very much the spirit of modernity, high, reaching upward, very, plain, majestic in a sense, but also very simple, glass and steel, cold, rational, not much warmth here. But, this is sort of very characteristic of the modern. And then late 20th century, early 21st, you get to postmodernity. And this is what postmodernity is all about. Everything melting into, sort of absurdity. What Zygmunt Bauman has called liquid modernity, right? This constantly shifting sands. There's nowhere to sort of stake your ground anymore. And as we see today, and this is a perfect image of, of the postmodern mind, where again, as Ustad Mubin will talk about tomorrow and particularly on Sunday in the session on gender, we can't even decide anymore what a man and a woman is. I mean, one of the most obvious things that has not baffled any previous culture is just everything's melting literally before our eyes, right? And when you see that, I mean, part of it is when you see the absurdity of it, it should reinforce your confidence in Islam, what Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad calls as the rock of ages. He says Islam is the only rock of ages left, right, in this world of kind of melting liquid modernity and constantly shifting sands, right? And then the idea too is if you want to constantly change and modernize and adapt Islam to your circumstances, good luck, because every time you move, the goalposts are shifting. So you want to reinterpret this doctrine and that practice, okay, fine. 10 years later, you're going to be called to do it again on something else, and you're constantly jumping through hoops with no end in sight, because there are actually, as we'll see, there are no actual foundational principles here. The foundational principles have been cut off. The ontology has been shorn down. The epistemology has been shorn down. Everything's been flattened out in the modern worldview, and with no usul, with no roots, everything is left to scatter to the winds. As we know also from the Quran and the beautiful verse about أَلَمْ تَرَ كَيْفَ ضَرَبَ اللَّهُ مَثَلًا كَلِمَةً طَيِّبَةً كَشَجَرَةٍ طَيِّبَةٍ أَصْلُهَا ثَابِتٌ وَفَرْعُهَا فِي السَّمَاءِ. Everyone knows this verse. Have you not seen how Allah has struck a similitude, a goodly word, which is interpreted mostly as La ilaha illallah, the shahada, right? The affirmation of the fundamental reality is like a goodly tree whose root is firm and whose branches reach up into the heavens, right? تُؤْتِي أُكُلَهَا كُلَّ حِينٍ بِإِذْنِ رَبِّهَا. It gives its fruit or bears its fruit from time to time with the permission of its Lord. وَيَضْرِبُ اللَّهُ الْأَمْثَالَ لِلنَّاسِ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَتَذَكَّرُونَ. Allah strikes similitudes or parables for people such that they might reflect. وَمَثَلُ كَلِمَةٍ خَبِيثَةٍ. And the likeness of a bad word or an untrue word, right? A word of kufr and disbelief, basically, is like, كَشَجَرَةٍ خَبِيثَةٍ اُجْتُثَّتْ مِنْ فَوْقِ الْأَرْضِ مَا لَهَا مِنْ قَرَارٍ. Right? It has been uprooted from the earth. A tree's been uprooted, no roots. It's going to fall over, right? And it's just lying on the ground. اُجْتُثَّتْ. It's been uprooted, and it's just lying there. مَا لَهَا مِنْ قَرَارٍ. It has no stability. And this is exactly what modernity is, and postmodernity is that on steroids. No stability whatsoever, because there are no roots, there are no foundations. And once you understand why, modernity is the way it is, why it's constantly changing, and especially postmodernity makes the absurdity clear to everybody, right? Then you can say, okay, I'm not even going to play that game because I understand that this is sort of kaleidoscopic. You keep turning the kaleidoscope and you get a totally new picture every 10 years. There's no point in trying to play that game because there's no end in sight. And it's not a fixed worldview like, okay, you're dealing with Christianity, which has, for example, usul and foundations and this. And of course, muharrafa, we know it's been, changed. It's not the deen that Isa alayhi salam brought. Nevertheless, there are, stable principles over centuries. Their teachings on certain things. If we were living in a very Christian society like Ireland before, say 20 years ago, okay, we disagree on this and we agree on that. And you can make whatever sort of accommodations, not, of course, compromising the deen, but you sort of make whatever adjustments you need to make to get along well in that society, and you know what you're dealing with, and you don't have to jump through new hoops every 5 or 10 years, right? That would be a very different situation, but it's not the situation in which we find ourselves. Okay, so again, very quickly, the major components of a worldview: the ontology, what exists. This is a quiz for you. You can ask yourselves: theology, who or what is God; epistemology, what is knowledge and how do we acquire it; anthropology, who or what is man; Teleology, it's a question of purpose. Morality and ethics, what is right and wrong, ought and do and do not. Law and politics, what is just law and the ideal political arrangement. Aesthetics, what is beauty, what is beautiful. Okay, we are going to, we are not going to talk about aesthetics because it just doesn't really fit into the program. And I will be talking about, in fact, I already have, but I'm going to wrap it up because I think the time is also running short. So today in my talk, we are covering mostly ontology. Ontology, epistemology, and anthropology. And Ustad Mubin tomorrow will be covering morality and ethics and law and politics. And again, these are derivative of these sort of higher considerations or more higher level considerations. And teleology kind of runs throughout, as we will see, it runs throughout the top three and also runs throughout the bottom three as well. Okay, so very briefly, because we're not going to talk about aesthetics and because this has been a very dry and philosophical presentation so far, I will just give you a couple of examples of Islam's answer to the question of aesthetics and its response to the notion that Allahu Jamilun yuhibbul jamal, Allah is beautiful and loves beauty. And the next slide is supposed to be a surprise, but you've already seen it. So this is Islam's answer to the question of what is beauty. This is also, I'm sorry, that's not a very clear image. This is the Sultan Ahmed Mosque in Istanbul. The first, of course, was the Taj Mahal, right? This is the inside of the Salimiya Mosque in Edirne, Turkey. This is Iran, Morocco. Left, you have Spain. It's written right there, MashaAllah, you can see right here. MashaAllah. Yep. Let me go back. Back. In the right, also, I believe Iran or Central Asia, beyond. Of course, Dome of the Rock. So that's Islam's answer to the question of beauty. Of course, we could put many examples of calligraphy here as well, of which we're all familiar. Okay, so to go back to the dry, here we have our paradigm again. This, people should kind of put in their minds and mark. Okay, so very, very quickly, if this were face-to-face, I'd be asking, are there any questions? Is everyone with me? But I'm going to keep going because the time is very limited. And also the format is not very conducive to a discussion, especially given the number of participants, mashallah. So main components of a worldview, you could take any two worldviews, Islamic worldview, modern worldview, Buddhism and Christianity, anything you want. You could put two worldviews or three or four and just fill in these boxes for each one, right? Just like you would do for a language. And then you can kind of get a good sense of what that worldview is like overall, okay? And so again, you would fill in ontology and theology, epistemology, anthropology, all of these. So what we're going to do in the next, the remaining time is that we are going to fill in the boxes, so to speak, of ontology and theology, or ontology, epistemology, and anthropology for both the Islamic worldview and the modern worldview. And we're going to see how they, stack up next to each other and talk a little bit about what the implications of that are. And tomorrow, Ustad Mubin will do morality, morals and ethics, law and politics, as I've said. Okay, so that's just the empty chart. And again, you could take any two worldviews and compare them. And there are other things we can add here. We could add economics. Obviously, we can add, production, right? How is life sustained? The move from an agriculturally based society to an industrial, that's also very, very important. So there are more things that can be added. This is not exhaustive, but these are, I think, at least conceptually kind of the most salient aspects of the worldview which really determine a great deal of what it is that we think and feel about the world and lie at the base of a lot of the questions and conundrums that we find ourselves in today as Muslims. Okay. All right, so first lecture we're doing today, anthropology, a case study would be evolution. We're not going to have time to go into it, but evolution, as I already mentioned, is a question of anthropology, but it also is very much tied into ontology, right, and epistemology, and it really brings all three of those realms together. Not so much ethics and politics and law, but those three all come together. And you cannot really talk about the question of evolution and human origins without looking at it comprehensively from the perspective of all three of these domains, which is usually not how it's done. And then tomorrow, Ustad Mubin will be talking about these, morality and ethics. Case studies, he's not necessarily going to address each one of these, but examples would be euthanasia, abortion, sexual ethics, death penalty, political alliances, and so forth. And again, I think 30 years ago, evolution would have been probably the overriding issue for most Muslims in the current world. And I think today, especially as science itself has been, in the popular mind has started to succumb to some of this sort of postmodern relativism itself, and its truth claims are kind of undermined for a lot of people, the absoluteness of them. Those have been replaced with new absolutes in the domain of, especially gender and sexuality and so forth, for a culture which claims not to have any absolutes or claims not to make any universal truth statements. There are very strong and very strict dogmas that are propagated daily on all of these issues, which allow for very little, if any, divergence, right? And heretics will pay, and we all know that the risks that people can run by even addressing some of these issues in a way that would be other than the sort of latest decrees that have been passed down from on high, from the intelligentsia, so-called intelligentsia. Okay, so in ontology, again, if I were doing this in a classroom, I would say raise your hands and let's start filling in the boxes, but we don't have time to do it, so I'm going to do it with you or for you very quickly. So ontology, again, the question of being, ilm al-wujud, if you want to translate this, what exists, what kind of things exist. So the first one, so let's start with the modern worldview on this one. So the empirical or natural world, quote unquote natural world, definitely exists. I mean, and for the modern world, nobody doubts that. That, if anything exists, then certainly what we see around us, what we can see, feel, touch, taste, access with our five senses, and the extension of those senses through, modern scientific instruments. That empirical natural world, of course, philosophers will debate everything. Does it really exist, or is it just a projection of my mind, Berkeley, and so forth? We don't need to get into that. Let's just be realists for now. But obviously, the modern worldview does not deny that the empirical world exists. What about us as Muslims? Do we believe also that the kind of world around us that we can see and access directly through our senses exists? Yes, of course we do. And we would call that, in our terminology, we would refer to that as a seen realm, the alam al-shahada, right? This is a Quranic term. Allah talks about al-ghayb wa-shahada, right? And we'll talk more about this kind of binary or dichotomy, okay? So, well, I actually just mentioned, so what else do we have as Muslims? In addition to the seen realm, we have the unseen realm, the alam al-ghayb. And in the Quran, these two terms usually come in together. And when they do, the ghayb is always precedes the shahada. Alimul ghaybi wa shahada. Allah is the knower of the unseen and the seen, right? Alif Lam Mim, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا بِالْغَيْبِ. Right, this is the book in the very first, verse of the Quran after Surah Al-Fatiha, right? In Surah Al-Baqarah, this is the book in which there is no doubt, guidance for the God-fearing. الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا بِالْغَيْبِ. Those who believe in, affirm, are profoundly convinced of the ghayb, the unseen realm. What exists in the unseen realm? Angels, for example, jinn, spirits, arwah, the barzakh, which is the interstice, after a person dies, so the life of the grave and so on and so forth between this world and the next, right? All of these things are not empirically accessible to us. But in the Quranic worldview, which is our worldview, the Islamic worldview, not only are these things real, but they are the fundamental realities. They are more fundamental. Allah always mentions the ghaib first, right? Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith that the likeness of this world that we know, the seen world, to the unseen world is like a ring thrown into the midst of a vast desert. So this entire seen world that we know, that modern science has shown us the enormous expanse of, trillions of light years and billions of galaxies and stars and things that we can't even imagine. They're just words that we say, but no one can really imagine what it means to be trillions of light years away. Okay, all of that is all alam al-shahada. And beyond that, the alam of ghayb is much greater and more principial and more foundational, more fundamental, right? And in the Quran, if anything, the alam al-shahada is sort of derivative in a sense of the alam al-ghayb. Okay, what about in the modern worldview? The supernatural world as such is basically denied as of the scientific revolution. So traditionally, of course, Christianity believes in angels and demons and spirits and so on and so forth, and a life beyond the grave. I mean, absolutely. But modern society, the modern worldview, there are still Christians in the modern world, but this kind of official modern worldview that which is kind of publicly negotiable between people, that which you will learn in public institutions, that which you must appeal to in order to make public knowledge claims, denies the supernatural world altogether. You can believe in it if you want, but it's just that. It's a subjective belief that you kind of hold on to with no good evidence, right? That's a question of epistemology, because evidence for the modern world means empirical evidence. And obviously I cannot have direct empirical evidence of super empirical facts. And of course, as a Muslim, I wouldn't really expect to, but also my sense of knowledge is not limited to simply that which is empirically verifiable, right? So this is a major difference. So supernatural world, you can just strike that out, right? That's gone, it's denied. And in the modern world, it's kind of like spooky, like poltergeist or whatever. Like people like to talk about the supernatural, but it's usually with the understanding, we don't really believe in that, right? That was sort of ignorant people of the past, but we're enlightened and we're beyond that, okay? And as was said, Mubin was telling me a few days ago, and he might mention it tomorrow, in the back door, however, when you deny Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and you deny the actual ghaib as transmitted, for example, through revelation, people are not really, human beings are built to strive for other than just the material. And so when you deny Allah in monotheism and tawheed, you don't just slide into pure materialism, but in doing so, you also open the door for a lot of neo-paganism to come back, right? That people are now going to, believe in all sorts of spirits and, Wiccan, this and that. And, people, there's been a revival of a lot of these sort of nature cults and animism and so on and so forth, because human beings long for, in a sense, by fitra, by their constitution, they long for that which transcends the material. And so if you tell them that there is no such thing and you deny the actual reality, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, well, they're going to find something else, including something else of a supernatural nature that they will project onto that, rather than living as purely earthly material beings, right? Which was the modern project, okay? What about Allah, right? And I put it obviously top, because God, if God exists, which of course as Muslims we affirm that he does, then that is the most fundamental existent al-haq. Allah is al-haq, right? So obviously Allah is first and foremost, and our entire worldview is derivative of that reality and is therefore theocentric to its core, right? That's very clear and explicit in Islam. What about the modern worldview? Big question mark. Big question mark as to whether God exists or not. Again, we said the 18th century, there's the rise of deism, this notion not of a personal God who hears prayers and quote unquote interferes or interacts with the universe, but rather he set it up in the beginning of time, wound it up like a clock, and then sort of let it, proceed on its own devices without really interfering. That's the 18th century view. And this kind of, again, psychologically and sociologically is a halfway house to atheism. And the reason is because a deistic God is not a God that one can really worship or pray to, because why would you pray if this God is not even listening or will not quote unquote interfere in your puny little life, because he set up this clock and it's just going on like, like a machine, right? And so this is a major, so we see again a deletion. So God is out of the picture, again, relegated to the realm of just private subjective belief, supernatural world the same. Of course, Allah for us in this world exists in the ghaib. So we could have put, angels, jinn, spirits, barzakh, God, but, so God is in the ghaib for us now. InshaAllah, we will be among those who see him on the day of judgment. May Allah make us all among the inhabitants of paradise, InshaAllah, Ameen. I put on the right an identifiable eschaton, and eschaton means sort of the ultimate outcome, the end of affairs. Are we heading somewhere? Is this world that exists, this material world as it's conceived by the modern scientific paradigm, is it heading towards anywhere? And the answer is no. There's sort of just time that's going on, kind of, the empty vessel. If anything, okay, we're told that the universe now like expands and then it's going to contract again and just implode or something like that. So if there's any type of eschaton, final end of things, it's a purely material destruction, right? On the Islamic side, how would we answer this? Well, there is an eschaton. There's resurrection after death. There's judgment, right? Al-ma'ad. So all of our eschatology, we normally refer to it as ma'ad, the return, meaning returning after death, coming back to life. And then moral accounting, extremely important. And then heaven and hell. And this goes on forever, right? So there's no ultimate end. The world as we know it comes to an end, but only to be replaced by a permanent creation, which represents the denouement of everything that has existed before it, right? So our lives have a purpose, which is, or have a dimension which ultimately will be transposed to the realm of eternity, to the realm of ultimacy, to the realm of ultimate permanent meaning, right? Which means the stakes are extremely high, but it also means that there is a very direct purpose and goal. And that's, again, extremely clear in Islamic scripture, in the Quran, more so probably than in any other text, including the Bible. You cannot read 2 pages of the Quran without coming across, the Day of Judgment in one way or another, and hammering home this notion that that is, hiya al-hayawan, that is the true life, that is the real life. People will be asked on that day, how long did you tarry on the earth? They will say, we tarried but a day or part of a day, right? 80 years, maybe you lived a day, you died at 40, as if you died at 1 or 2 in the afternoon, right? And this is nothing in comparison to eternity, right? But again, in the modern worldview, scratch that out. And then the last thing we could say, is there any objective meaning or teleology? Not really, because if you're dealing with a purely materialistic universe, and even human beings are thought to have just, sort of come up from lower material forms with no kind of direction or purpose behind it, there is no meaning, right? The world just kind of came into existence, and it's just there. It's a brute fact, and your life is the same. And again, this is part of what feeds into and also is fed off of the subjectivism of modernity, that it's up to each individual now to project his or her own meaning onto the world. You generate it within yourself, and you project it onto the world, and you project it onto your life. And if it were not for your subjective projection of a meaning and a purpose, there would be no meaning and purpose, because there is no meaning and purpose, objectively speaking. For us, obviously, completely different. The cosmos, human life, are infused with purpose and meaning. Very simple example, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. I did not create jinn and mankind, but to worship me, right? That is our purpose for existing, and we can go on and on about that. It's a very rich view of the world, but it's infused with purpose and meaning from start to finish. So if you look really at the Islamic worldview, and I want people to kind of appreciate this, it's very thick, it's very rich, it has strong, principled, and meaningful, answers to, or I would say a very thick, meaningful, and well-integrated and multifarious ontology, a thick account of what exists that actually responds meaningfully to all different concerns of a human being. If you look at the modern worldview, except for the natural empirical world, everything else is either a question mark, including the most important question, which is that of the existence of God, right? And then everything else, supernatural world, identifiable eschaton, objective meaning or teleology, scratch, scratch, scratch. So what does it leave you with? Very thin, very flat, very, Stephen Smith calls it or I think Weber said, Max Weber, the secular cage of modernity. It's like you're in a cage, right? And everything, all these higher levels have been closed off. And Sayyid Hussein Nasr points out, for example, he says, modern man, right? We know so much about our empirical knowledge of the Shahada, the realm of the Shahada, has increased astronomically in the last couple hundred years. And we know now again about these billions and trillions of stars and galaxies and all of that. But this is all flat knowledge. In other words, it's all the alim of Shahada, which we said is like the ring in the desert compared to the ghaib. So we have a very broad lateral view of the empirical realm, but every other higher realm has been completely shut off. So the window has been closed from above, and therefore he says, right, that never has man so seldomly looked up to the stars as modern man. So we know about all of these stars, but do we ever look up into the heavens? And when we do we really see, again, with our basira, anything other than just lights in the sky? You see what I'm saying? So our knowledge is tremendously exponentially, it's like all the media that you're exposed to every day with tons of information, but it's all just kind of like information. It's all just purely material, especially our knowledge of the world. But the realms of meaning, the realms of value, the realms of objective, purpose and so forth, all of that has been systematically denied. So this leaves you with a very stripped down, very poor worldview, actually. And it's not something that any Muslim should feel shy in front of or feel that we have to bow to. Because when you see it like this, well, why would you? This is obviously very deficient compared to the Islamic worldview. So I'm going to go very quickly into, from Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold, English poet and a social critic, lived from 1822 to 1888. And you may have heard this. He's talking about the kind of retreat of faith in Europe in the 19th century. And he says, listen, you hear the grating roar of pebbles which the waves draw back and fling at their return up the high strand. Begin and cease and then again begin with tremulous cadence slow and bring, watch this, the eternal note of sadness in. Why sadness? The sea of faith was once too at the full and round earth's shore, lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long, withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind down the vast edges, drear and naked shingles of the world, right? So again, this was actually this sort of loss of faith was a very cataclysmic thing in Europe, and we should not take for granted the secularity of the world in which we live. And if you go back just into the 19th century and you read literature of the time, it's already much thicker and more, people appeal to God unself-consciously, even in like not quote unquote religious literature. Shakespeare, I mean, clearly, but even 19th century literature, people talk about honor, virtue, morality, God, the afterlife. These are very much still part of people's worldviews, but it's retreating and leaving this kind of long, melancholy retreat, this withdrawing roar, okay? Our view of the world, our ontology, our ontology, as we said, everything that exists around us, this world, I don't want to call it a material world, the world that modern science refers to or views as just material. And Descartes even said, like, animals basically are just machines, he said, okay? This world is infused with meaning. The entire world is a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything around us is an ayah pointing to the greatness and majesty and existence of its creator, right? And we have many verses in the Quran which give this meaning. For example, وَإِن مِّن شَيْءٍ إِلَّا يُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِهِ وَلَكِنْ لَا تَفْقَهُونَ تَسْبِيحَهُمْ. There is nothing that exists except that is hymning the praises of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, except you do not hear its praises, right? تُسَبِّحُ لَهُ السَّمَاوَاتُ وَالْأَرْضُ وَمَنْ فِيهِنْ, that the heavens and the earth are singing the praises of Allah and everything in them, right? وَالشَّمْسُ وَالْقَمَرُ بِحُسْبَانٍ وَالنَّجْمُ وَالشَّجَرُ يَسْجُدَانِ, that the sun and the moon are in a sort of, calculated orbit, and that the small shoot and the big tree are making sujood, i.e. they're worshiping their Lord, right? وَلِلَّهِ يَسْجُدُ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ مِنْ وَلِلَّهِ يَسْجُدُ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ مِنْ دَابَةٍ وَالْمَلَائِكَةُ وَهُمْ لَا يَسْتَكْبِرُونَ. In the verse goes, يَخَافُونَ رَبَّهُمْ مِنْ فَوْقِهِمْ وَيَفْعَلُونَ مَا يُؤْمَرُونَ. To Allah prostrates everything that is in the heavens and the earth, of beasts and also the angels and so forth. أَلَمْ تَرَ أَنَّ اللَّهَ يَسْجُدُ لَهُ مَنْ فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَنْ فِي الْأَرْضِ وَالشَّمْسُ وَالْقَمَرُ وَالنُّجُومُ وَالْجِبَالُ وَالشَّجَرُ وَالدَّوَابُ وَكَثِيرٌ مِنَ النَّاسِ. Do you not see that to Allah prostrates all that is in the heavens and the earth, the sun and the moon and the stars and the mountains and the trees and the beasts on the earth and many among mankind, right? So this is our view of the world. And as I gave you before from Surah Ibrahim, the idea of this shajara, the tree that is firmly planted in the root. If you are a mu'min and this infuses your worldview, when you look at a tree, not every time you see one, but in moments of tafakkur, and Allah tells us to be people of reflection, you will look at the tree and see not only is it making tasbih to its Lord, it's not just a material thing that I can just, treat and cut it down and burn, who cares? It is a sign of its Lord. It's making tasbih, although I cannot understand its tasbih. And also Allah has infused it with moral and spiritual meaning, because I can look at it and say, oh, it has roots and it's standing tall and its branches go into the heavens and it gives fruit. Such should be the mu'min who is on the kalimat al-tawheed, right? And then you look at the tree that's uprooted and you say, that's kufr, right? And that is uprootedness, and that is, there's no thabat, there's no qarar, right? And so even Allah has pointed and made various aspects of the creation pregnant with meaning, pregnant with spiritual meaning, pregnant with moral direction, right, for us. Now compare this view of the world quickly to our famous Richard Dawkins, who again is probably one of the loudest sort of anti-religious voices today and proponents, horsemen of atheism. And he says, right, in a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. Okay? So if that's the worldview you want, ahlan wa sahlan, it's not mine. All right, I think I've been getting some chat. It's probably saying you need to stop now. Can we go on a little bit, or should we stop right here? I mean, there's more to do, but there's obviously a lot to say, and I don't want to mess up the schedule here. So, Sheikh Azimuddin.
Yeah, inshallah, you can continue. If you there's a Q&A session on top, the Q&A on top, you just press that. It'll show you there's like 8 questions. You can see whichever is if you feel like you can. It needs
well, if I can take maybe 10 more minutes, then I'd like to actually just maybe finish fleshing this out.
Okay.
Sharif, if you want, I can take a stab at the questions, and that way you can continue. Does that work?
And Ustad Mubin, you can also text the answers on the Q&A panel.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Exactly. I just typed them out.
Maybe afterwards, so we're not distracting people, or
okay, that's fine.
Yeah,
afterwards.
Okay.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. All right. I would do it too, but I have to run also to Jamar. So. All right, epistemology. So very quickly here, again, there's tons that could be said here, and there are many slides that I have that we won't be able to talk about, but where's my animation? Okay, so modern worldview, how do we know, right? What are our channels of knowledge? Sense experience obviously is a primary one in the modern scientific worldview. Do we as Muslims believe that we can get knowledge through sense experience? Yes, of course we do. We call it hiss in Arabic. What else? Reason, obviously, right? This is the Enlightenment project to base all knowledge on basically reason and sense experience. You have rationalism, you have empiricism, and debates between the two, but sort of what everyone agrees on, the ijma' of sort of the Enlightenment project is that reason and sense experience somehow with variegated weight given to one or the other, and one or the other made primary over the other, but these two together sort of provide knowledge, and really they're the only kind of sources that do that. So we also have reason as Muslims. We believe in reason. Aql, it's also called fu'ad, qalb, lub. We have different words. So the mind, the heart, these words are not necessarily separated. Again, even in reason, in English, even different Western languages, don't necessarily make the same distinctions between mind, heart, soul, spirit, so anyway, we don't need to go into that. But again, even how you conceive of these different faculties of the human being is very much tied to a worldview which is reflected in language. So for example, in French and in German, the word for spirit and mind are the same, whereas in English, we think of spirit and mind as two very different things, right? And it's only in context, Geist in German, Esprit in French, which is related to the English word spirit, is derived from esprit. So anyway, without belaboring the point, what other sources of knowledge? So we agree so far, sense, experience, reason. One that is very important for us and that we put a lot of explicit stress on as Muslims is report, known as khabar or khabar sadiq, meaning a truthful report, okay? Anything that we know from history, for example, or places that we've never been to, like I'm convinced of the existence of the city of Timbuktu, although I've never been there before. I have, mass transmitted mutawatir reports that such a city exists. It's not possible that everyone could have conspired, to sort of fool us of that. So we can say with certainty Timbuktu exists, although I have no direct empirical experience of it myself. And of course, I cannot derive its existence logically because it's not a logical necessity. The modern world, of course, also has reports. I mean, again, any historical knowledge and tons of knowledge is known through report, but it's not conceptually central in the modern mind. When you talk about the tools of knowledge, it's really sense, experience, and reason. Report is there, but it's just kind of de facto there. But for us as Muslims, it's quite central. And the reason for that is that a very specific kind of report, right, a subsection of a report, which again, once it exists, now has pride of place in our epistemic panoply, is, this is the wrong order here. Intuition, maybe in the modern world, we talk about, say, fitra, also spiritual intuition, hads and kashf. We don't need to talk too much about these. These are more personal, but, we do, those have a reality to them. But what I meant to say is that a subsection of report is revelation, obviously. And if revelation exists, i.e. revelation communicated from Allah, God, the creator of the universe, then in the epistemic hierarchy, it would naturally come first because it is direct report of the creator of the universe himself, which, in a sense is therefore primary over the other sources of knowledge, right? So revelation, wahi, tanzil, Quran and Sunnah, these are revelation in different senses. We can't get into that right now. but everyone knows what we mean by revelation, mostly when we talk about Islam. And this is absolutely central. In the modern worldview, again, it's gone, right? Revelation is taken out of the picture. It's thrown out as a source of knowledge. First of knowledge, Galileo said famously, the Bible tells you how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. In other words, it has nothing to do with the actual sort of ontological and cosmological reality of the world, but it's there for moral instruction. And that view has lasted until quite recently. People in the West would turn to the Bible, at least in a general sense, for moral direction, but that's basically been overturned, especially with the rise of the sexual revolution, when sexual ethics, which used to be key to Christian norms up until the 1960s, were kind of brazenly and brashly overturned. And we have other panels that will talk about that and the extremely serious effects of that. And so that's gone. Now just notice, so you don't see the same level of deletion as you do with the ontology, where the modern worldview basically deleted everything except for empirical evidence. Sense experience is here, reason is here, report is there. The last, we don't really need to belabor the bottom thing, but notice what you lose when you lose revelation as a source of knowledge, right? You lose, you can come to some rational, like natural theology, existence of God from the modern perspective, but without religion, your view of who Allah is and what his qualities and attributes are and what he wants from us and how he interacts with us is very, very limited. You can just come up with, the basic 7 attributes of the Ash'aris and others talk about, right? Allah must exist and be one and so on and so forth, different from creation. But you cannot really go beyond that. Of course, our own theology would be much impoverished if we did not actually, rely on the data of revelation itself, what Allah says about himself, for us to know Allah in detail. So that's gone. Knowledge of things like angels and jinn, gone. Knowledge of, life after death, which is huge. In fact, that's what the whole point is for us as Muslims, right? That's totally gone. If you don't have revelation, these are not things that you can derive through sense experience because they don't exist yet. And they're not, even if they did, and there's disagreement to heaven and hell, if they've already been created or not, but even if they have been, we don't have empirical, access to them, so we could not know them through our sense experience. We cannot derive them through reason either. So when you lose revelation, right, you're losing actually a huge and the most fundamental parts of the worldview. So don't let this, single kind of massive deletion fool you. It's absolutely fundamental, okay? We're not going to go through any of this, deductive versus inductive, certainty versus inconclusive knowledge, where revelation is, where science is, and all of that's important. What to do if, different types of knowledge conflict, whether rational or scientific with revelation-based knowledge. There's a lot of discussion to be had about that. Unfortunately, we can't go into it now. Maybe at some other point we can do a little add-on or something like that. Anthropology, very quickly, and then we'll have to end. Anthropology, who or what is man? Wait, what is this? Oh, wait a minute. Oh, that's weird. That's not supposed to be there. Ignore that for now. Okay. Modern worldview, Islamic world and modern worldview, we both believe that man has a body, obviously, right? And that, a substantial part of what makes us who we are is our body. You can first tell that a creature is a human being by looking at its body, right? So that's clear. Mind, the modern worldview, people do talk about mind. In fact, you have the whole mind-body duality from Descartes onward, and many have said that, all of modern philosophy is basically a footnote in a commentary upon Descartes' this Cartesian dualism between the mind and the body. There's, of course, a raging debate today as to whether mind is some type of, immaterial substance that is correlated with the body, or if it's fully reducible to brain function. And that is can we collapse mind into body, or is mind actually something separate, right? And that we are composed of at least 2 sort of independent substances, mind and body, which are closely dependent on each other and closely correlated, but nevertheless not of the same substance. So that's a debate, but mind and body, we'll treat them, separately, as it has been done, and I think as we also have the right to do as Muslims. So we also believe in mind, again, mind, heart, aql, qalb, fuad, lub, how are we going to define the mind/heart? Again, even in Western languages, you have different words that sort of cut this up differently. What about spirit or soul? Of course, in Islam, very central. We have the nafs, also ruh, and there's debates about whether these are the same or different, or whether when they're used together they're different, but separately they imply each other, so on and so forth. But this is very وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ. They ask you about the ruh. Say the ruh is min amri rabbi وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. Say the ruh is of the affair of my Lord, and you have been given of knowledge but little. So the ruh is obviously very important to central, and we know that our nafs, our ruh, that immaterial aspect of us, إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ, nothing will avail on the day of judgment except the belief that one comes with, and the salamati of the the salama of one's heart, right? That one comes to Allah with a sound heart, the soundness of the heart, the qalb, the ruh, the nafs, right? In the modern world, is there a soul? Well, big question mark. I think probably most modern people would be quite skeptical. Mind and body, maybe. Soul sounds a little bit too mystical, suspiciously religious, quote unquote. Of course, religious is suspicious in the modern world. Very central to our definition of a human being is language, right? The fact that we're able to articulate, which is nataqa, mantiq. Of course, mantiq also means rational thought. That's why the human being is called al-hayawan and natiq, the rational animal. This is taken from the Aristotelian definition, also the rational animal, that language and thought are very closely tied. But for us, I would say also from the Quran, وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ, that Allah taught Adam the names of all things, taught him language, taught him how to articulate, taught him how to recognize things and refer to them, right? This is actually very central to us in the definition of a human being. From the modern kind of evolutionary paradigm, language, of course, is a feature of human beings, but it's not seen, as far as I can tell, as being definitional to. It's more periphery and an add-on that comes. But the modern worldview, being based in materialism, looks mostly at body. And when you talk about evolution, you're talking about, if anything, the evolution of material forms of a morphology, a physical morphology, from Homo, erectus, the one before it, I forgot, Homo erectus, then Homo sapiens or whatever, standing upright, having an opposable thumb, all of that. These are taken as being fundamental in what we're trying to explain, quote unquote, when we talk about man, who man is, what the human being is. But these other features, a soul is debatable, language, yeah, it's there, but it's not essential. I would say for us, if you're going to try to give me a story of how man came about, I need, well, the last thing too, moral responsibility is very endemic and important to our notion of what a human being is, that we are mukallafin, that we exist in a moral realm. With قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً, I'm creating a khalifa in the earth, a vicegerent in the earth. And this means that the fact that we exist as moral beings who can choose to act or not to act, who can do good and do evil and carry the moral consequences of that, that is central. Just like language is central, that's central, an indefeasible part of our definition of what it means to be a human being. And in the modern, again, sure, yeah, we're morally responsible. Some would deny that if you're pure determinist, right? But in general, people kind of, just instinctively understand that we are morally responsible beings in some sort, but that's kind of seen as incidental. And I think part of the, debate about like evolution and all of that is that the evolutionary story, and I'll have to end here, as I mentioned way back in the beginning, that to sort of concede to science alone the right to pronounce itself over the origins of man is already to concede, a huge amount of ground to a materialistic view of the world, because science, modern science, is a endeavor that is designed to be able to look at only the empirical world, the realm of the shahada, and only to be able to discern patterns therein. Okay, so if you ask science a question, it can only spit back to you a materialistic and essentially deterministic answer, more or less. I mean, of course, 20th century developments have brought, in to question the previous kind of strong deterministic notions that were born of the kind of clockwork model of the universe that came up in the 17th century and beyond. But in general, that's the type of answer it's going to give you. So don't be surprised if you're only looking to science for the answer, that it's going to spit out at you a materialistic answer of a material creature. And then you turn around and say, well, that undermined my faith. Well, what did you expect, right? The question before you go to one particular realm of human endeavor for an answer or not, you have a prior question to ask: what is man? What is this creature whose origins I'm asking about? Because if you're only going to give me a story about bodies, right, which is all really evolution can do, and maybe mind and language kind of emergent from, but again, from materiality, which is, difficult to even defend that sort of philosophically and ontologically, right? But you have to first define what is this insan whose origins you're looking for. And I'd say for us, again, we have a very rich and true to life. I mean, this is true to how we all know ourselves to be, right? We have a mind, body, but also mind, a soul, language, very central, moral responsibility. If a creature doesn't have all of those things, that's not an insan. I don't care if it walks upright. I don't care if it has an opposable thumb. If it's not mukallaf, then it's not an insan. If it doesn't have language, it's not an insan. If it doesn't have a ruh blown into it by Allah, it's not an insan, right? So I want to know the origins of the insan, not what science calls Homo sapiens. Those might not be the same thing to begin with, right? And so it's important for us to see that the question of anthropology is not primarily an empirical question. I mean, empirical is part of it, of course, right? But not empirical in the reductive sense of the modern scientific project, okay? I mean, it's empirical in the sense that we all know from our own experience that we have language, moral responsibility, and so forth, okay? And again, the modern worldview flattens it out. It's reductive. It tries to reduce things like, soul to mind, mind to body, and so forth, right? It tries to reduce one thing to another, but we would reject that and say, no, you have to leave the reality in its fullness, right, and account for it as such without trying to artificially squash it down into that secular or materialistic iron cage. Okay, very quickly, some defining characteristics of modernity, and then we will end on this. You all recognize this, but just to take a step back now from the kind of philosophical nitty-gritty to back more to the kind of cultural ethos that we're facing that we all know very well, but often don't articulate. Some defining characteristics, modernity is, wait a minute. So, disenchantment of the world, the loss of sacred and metaphysical understandings of all facets of life and culture. Okay, that's a major feature. Max Weber talks about this. Charles Taylor also in his book, The Secular Age. Rationalization, so the world can be understood and managed through a reasonable and logical system of objectively accessible theories and data. But mind you, objectively accessible purely in an empirical, sense, and therefore reason based purely on what's empirically available with no, obviously, revelation does not, come into this in the modern world. Secularization, the loss of religious influence and or religious belief at a societal level and also at a personal level, because the two also cannot be, we are social creatures and our society affects our individuality and vice versa. There's a dialectic relationship between the two. Alienation, isolation of the individual from systems of meaning such as family, meaningful work, religion, clan, etc. Commodification, the reduction of all aspects of life to objects of monetary consumption and exchange. Okay, further characteristics, decontextualization, the removal of social practices, beliefs, and cultural objects from their local cultures of origin, especially in the day of like the modern monoculture. Individualism, very, very important. Growing stress on individuals as opposed to mediating structures such as family, clan, academy, village, and church. Okay. Nationalism, the rise of the modern nation states as rational centralized governments that often cross local ethnic groupings. Subjectivism, extremely important too, just like individualism, to turn inward for definitions and evaluations of truth and meaning, right? Again, there's no objective purpose out there. There's no God who objectively exists, who created the world for a purpose and, sort of a coherent cosmos, which was very much the medieval picture, also the Greek picture, even in a non sort of theistic milieu. But in the modern period, you get this subjectivist, very subjective. We talked about that before, but it's extremely important. Objectivism, in a different sense, the belief that truth claims can be established by autonomous information accessible by all, but again, purely empirical. And of course, revelation having nothing to do with that. Otherwise, we would agree with this, that, truth claims can be established by autonomous information, but revelation is a very important part of that, and it's objectively available, and you can point to it. If you disagree on something, فَرُدُّوهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ, return it to, refer back to Allah and His Messenger. Universalism, very important application of ideas and claims to all cultures and circumstances, regardless of local distinctions. So again, modernity in a sense is, puts all, especially postmodernity, all grand narratives into question, but at the same time, whatever its own beliefs and practices are, it immediately sees those as universal and tries to impose those on the entire world. First, it was sort of scientism, nationalism, the modern nation state, all through colonialism. Today, it's, again, we've LGBT and feminism and all of these other, radical skepticism, which is incoherent to say that, skepticism is sort of our one, fixed point. I mean, that's sort of self-refuting, but now there's a attempt to impose this on the whole world. You can't just let other people be, because if they're not following these particular beliefs, they're objectively wrong because these are universal, right? Reductionism, I mentioned this, the belief that something can be understood by studying the parts that make it up. Of course, if I take my telephone apart, right, I can see what makes it up, but it's not a phone anymore. I have to put it back together, and the whole is greater than the parts, right? Qualitatively too, and not just quantitatively. And modern science, again, it's reductive. So you look at the human being, you reduce soul to mind, mind to body, body to biology, biology to chemistry, chemistry to physics, and it's reductionist, right? That's not a human being. Put it all back together, that's a human being. Okay, mass society, I won't read that. Homogenization, therapeutic motivations is important. The understanding that the human self is a product of evolutionary desires, and that the self should be assisted in achieving those desires, as opposed to projects of ethical improvement or pursuits of public virtue. Again, radically opposed to Islamic notions of what we are here to be doing. And we'll end on this, and Ustad Mubin will actually pick up tomorrow on some of the implications of this. Conditions of the modern self assumes an autonomy that seeks to reject the claims of authority, tradition, or community. We see this rampant. Searches for personal therapy that only results in the subjective experience of well-being. The true, the good, and the beautiful are undiscoverable, right? They don't objectively exist out there, so they are judged as not applicable to human experience. Or we could say it's for each person to just make them up and decide and project them, but there's no objective truth to any of this. Has moved from an emphasis on redemption of character to liberation from social inhibitions. This, again, rampant, very much marks our cultural ethos. Identity is self-constructed through self-consumption of products of desire. And finally, such claims about identity and truth call for technical mastery of the environment, as well as a division between the public and private spheres of reality.
Okay. So Sharif, I think we're going to be transitioning right into the next session.